Why do they call you Little Blue? Playing in his bath as some of us do. He bit his mummy's fountain pen and broke it in two. The ink it squirted in the water, wow! His mummy has a blue boy now. They scrubbed and rubbed, he cried and kicked up a din. The more they washed it off, the more it washed in. He cried, oh mummy, mummy, what shall I do? I'll have to stay a little blue.
One day, it was 4:15 at Haythorn School, and the end of the last lesson. Mrs. Gittings said to her class, "You may go now, children, very quietly. But, Little Blue, could I have a word with you?" So all the children scampered out, fairly quietly, and Little Blue remained at his desk, looking rather miserable. "Little Blue, dear, is there something the matter?" asked Mrs. Gittings kindly. And Little Blue said, "Yes." And Mrs. Gittings said, "Is it your arithmetic?" And Little Blue said, "No," because arithmetic is always awful. Then Mrs. Gittings guessed. It was English, and Little Blue nodded. "Well, dear," she said, "I didn't want to say anything in front of the other children, but your story writing isn't very sparkling at the moment. Not very much imagination. And you know, you should use the dictionary for words you can't spell." Little Blue sighed. "But there are so many words I have to look up that I don't have enough time for the story, miss. And Geoffrey West is always teasing me because he writes longer stories than I do." "Longer is not necessarily better," said Mrs. Gittings. "Never mind what Geoffrey West says, dear. When we do our story tomorrow, you just try and do as well as you can. That's all that matters." "Yes, miss," said Little Blue, feeling much more cheerful, and he hurried out of school to find his friends. He knew where they would be, at the waste ground behind his cottage. There were lots of old cardboard boxes there, and they had just started this craze for car racing. "Come on, Little Blue," cried Kipper Guppy. He and Agatha Bagshot and Geoffrey West were sitting inside their cardboard racing cars. It looked a bit funny, really, but the idea was to sit in the box and push yourself along without getting up. Whoever reached the end of the waste ground first was the winner. There was only one very large box left, so Little Blue poked another hole in front so that he could see where he was going, and Agatha cried, "Ready, steady, go!" And off they went. Of course they moved very slowly, but they imagined they were going at least 100 miles an hour. Suddenly, bump! Little Blue looked out of his hole and saw a large pair of feet he thought he recognized. "Hoity-toity! What on earth are you doing, boy?" It was Mrs. Jellybun. "We're having a car race, Mummy," said Little Blue, "and I was willing, until just now." "Indeed," snorted Mrs. Jellybun. "Well, your tea is ready, so you can choose between your race and sardine sandwiches." Now, sardine sandwiches is one of Little Blue's favourite teas, so he climbed out of his box and followed his mummy home. But when he sat down for his tea, what do you think? He didn't feel hungry. Mrs. Jellybun was not very pleased. "You're looking flushed, boy," she said. "All that bouncing about. And what have you done to your trousers? You had better go straight to bed." "Yes, Mummy," said Little Blue. He didn't argue because he was feeling a bit sick. Up in his bedroom, he put on his pyjamas, brushed his teeth, and knelt down to say his prayers. "God bless Mummy and Uncle Oompa and Mr. and Mrs. Gittings and Miss Gusset and Agatha and Kipper and Geoffrey West, I suppose." Then he got into bed. But he had to get out again after a while, because there was a full moon and the light was shining into his eyes. He drew the curtains. That was better. Mrs. Jellybun looked in a few minutes later and thought, "Good, he's fast asleep. He's tired himself out." Little Blue was suddenly sitting in a cardboard spaceship on his way to the moon. At his side, He had his sardine sandwiches and 2 cans of fizz. He looked back at the earth, which was very small, and in front of him was the moon, getting larger and larger. Then he was overtaking 3 other cardboard spaceships, and he saw 3 faces, Agatha, Kipper, and Geoffrey West. "I'm winning," he called out, but they didn't hear. Then, to his great surprise, Mr. and Mrs. Gittings were overtaking him on their japonicas. Was everyone going to the moon? Suddenly he felt a bump, and he had landed. He got out. There was no one there, just miles and miles of moon. "I must find the others," he thought, and he started to walk over the grey dust. Bounce, 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 he went, because of course you don't weigh so much on the moon. He had read about that. It made him feel rather sick. Just then, fut, 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 Mrs. Gittings bounced up on her japonica. "Hello!" cried Little Blue, delighted to find someone he knew, but she frowned at him very fiercely. "Your story writing is terrible. Where is your exercise book and pencil? You said you were going to write a much better story." "But there isn't any school on the moon, miss." "Don't argue with me, you naughty boy," snapped Mrs. Gittings, and then, fut, 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 off she went. Little Blue couldn't believe his ears. Mrs. Gittings was always so kind. He wandered about, becoming more and more miserable, trying to find his friends, but they were nowhere to be seen. He was getting hungry, and he realized with horror that he had left his sandwiches and fizz in the spaceship. "Oh dear," he sighed, "I'm lost." And he called out, "Agatha, Kipper, Geoffrey, help!" But there was no reply. So he set off again, and almost at once he fell down the side of a large crater. And there was Mrs. Jellybun sitting at the bottom. "I'm sorry I'm late for tea, Mummy," he said, so relieved to have found her. But Mrs. Jellybun frowned at him. "How can you be late for tea, boy, when there isn't any? You don't have tea on the moon." No tea? This was awful. His head started swimming, and he felt very dizzy. Then he heard his mummy's voice calling out, "Wake up, boy, or you'll be late for school again." "No, Mummy," he murmured, "there isn't any school on the moon." "No, I don't suppose there is, but you're not on the moon, are you? You're in Meadow Cottages, and your breakfast is on the table." Breakfast! Little Blue sat up and looked round. He had got back to Earth quickly. Then he realized, as I expect you have, that he had only been dreaming. It was a great relief, I can tell you. When he went into the classroom after prayers, Mrs. Gittings smiled at everyone and said, "Now, children, story writing. Today you may write about anything you like." As usual, Little Blue's mind was empty at first. What could he write about? And then suddenly he had this wonderful idea. What about the exciting journey he had just made in his dream? He could remember all sorts of things, landing on the moon in his cardboard spaceship, seeing Mr. and Mrs. Gittings on their japonicas, and finding his mummy when he fell down the crater. He sharpened his pencil and wrote and wrote and wrote. Mrs. Gittings looked up from her correcting and thought, "Little Blue is enjoying writing his story today. He hasn't looked out of the window once." By the end of the lesson, he had filled 4 pages of his exercise book, nearly twice as much as usual. Mrs. Gittings was so impressed that she read his story during break, and at the end of the morning she called him up and said, "Little Blue, dear, well done. This is the best story you've ever written. I would like you to read it out aloud to the rest of the class this afternoon." So he did, and everyone thought it was marvellous. After school, Little Blue hurried home to show Mrs. Jellybun his story. When he passed the waste ground, Agatha and Kipper and Geoffrey West were fitting all their cardboard boxes together. "Come on, Little Blue," shouted Agatha. "We've got a new game. We're going to the moon in our spaceship." Little Blue said, "No, I'm not allowed to in my clean trousers." But Mrs. Jellybun was so pleased with his story, she said, "Well,
I suppose you can go to the waste ground if you put on your old trousers.
And what do you think? She even came and watched them all playing their new game.
Why don't you come with us, Mrs. Jellybun? Kipper called out. No, thank you, said Mrs. Jellybun. You can go to the moon. I'm quite happy here on Earth.
Little Blue, Little Blue, why do they call you Little Blue? Playing in his bath as some of us do, he bit his mummy's fountain pen and broke it in two. The ink it squirted in the water, wow! His mummy has a blue boy, mummy has a blue boy.